everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. Today's guest is author Peter Connors. If you are a reader of nonfiction and enjoy books about the Grateful Dead or the Jamband scene at large and history mixed in there, chances are that you've at least heard of Peter, but hopefully you've read some of his books. Some of the titles include JAMerica, the history of the Jamband and festival scene; White Hand Society, the psychedelic partnership of Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg; Cornell 77, the music, the myth, and the magnificence of the Grateful Dead's concert at Barton Hall; Growing Up Dead, the hallucinated confessions of a teenage deadhead; and Beyond the Edge of Suffering, a book of prose poems. You notice that all of these titles have at least two things in common. First, they all somehow revolve around the Grateful Dead or the Jamband scene, and second, they're all works of nonfiction. However, Peter's latest release is a novel, his first published fictional work. It is called Merch Table Blues, and by the time this episode airs, it should be available everywhere you get books. Listen carefully to the first segment of this interview, and you'll hear more specific websites and ways where you can find it and simultaneously support independent booksellers. Also, you can find relevant links in today's show notes of how to get Merch Table Blues. For today's episode, Peter picked Chalkdust Torture from July 20th, 1991 at Arrowhead Ranch. I was so thrilled when he chose this track and the show in general because it's lived in my mind's eye for so long. The 1991 Horn Tour provided so many of my first tapes so long ago that the Arrowhead Ranch shows in particular have gained legendary status. The first night of that two-night run opened with Chalkdust Torture, which was a new song at that point, and the band never looked back. It was satisfying to hear about that show and that venue after listening to it for so many years. So let's join Peter Connors to talk about his writing process, upstate New York, and how Phish in 1991 was the same band and yet entirely different from the Phish that we know today, as we discuss Phish's performance of Chalkdust Torture from July 20th, 1991 at Arrowhead Ranch in Parksville, New York. Peter, thank you for being on Attendance Bias. How are you?
Good, Brian. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I'm excited to talk to you about a variety of topics today. Your background, your history as a writer, your newest novel, Merch Table Blues, and also Phish in 1991. And you picked Chalkdust Torture from a classic show, July 20th, 1991. So we have a lot on the table today. The first thing I'd like to tell you is I first heard of you before you contacted me. Obviously, I was aware of your books, but I had a previous guest, another writer named Elizabeth Beck, who is a recent author of a trilogy. I think she calls it the Summer Tour Trilogy. And she name-checked you. She name-checked your book called Growing Up Dead as a major inspiration for her. So that sent me down the rabbit hole of Peter Connors. And so when I looked more because you've written about the Dead show at Cornell 77, specifically the history of festivals and jam bands. So you're clearly passionate about the scene. Before we get to Merch Table Blues, how did you first get into the jam band scene and what led you to write about it?
Yeah, so I first got into it, and it was probably around, I would always been a big, music fan in general. I was the youngest of four siblings and was exposed to tons of music, from my brother's album collections and stuff like that. So early on, I was always really drawn to music and drawn to the lyrics, especially, I think, I really had a good ear for those. But the jam band scene specifically, I'd say, in the mid 80s, maybe 1985 or so, I started to hang out with people who had Grateful Dead bootlegs, and those started to circulate some. And I got really fascinated by them and listened to those, and then went to my first Dead show at Kingswood Music Theater in 1987. And from that point on, I was on the bus. And so what happened at that point really was, a bunch of different things, that interests of mine, like creative writing, like music. And at that point, like wanting to have adventure and to meet people and to travel and stuff like that, it all came together through the Grateful Dead. And I started to just, go to as many shows as I can and as I could. And then, Phish came into my world in my first show with them was at Potsdam College. It was actually a free show they played on Earth Day at our student union. But we had tapes of them before that. And I'd like Trey's thesis, the man who stepped into tomorrow.
Into yesterday.
Into yesterday, thank you. Yeah, that, we had a whole bunch of stuff because we were so I was in Potsdam, which was close to Burlington. So we were really early on, into them, and all the people who, really came in through the Grateful Dead scene. So, some of my first Phish songs that I heard were like filler on Grateful Dead bootlegs. And there was a big overlap in that early on. And I was really drawn to them, immediately. And at that point, the Grateful Dead scene had gotten so huge. And
talking about 1991 or the early 90s?
Yeah, this is 1991. Yeah. It had gotten, just really huge. And so it was really cool to be able to just go to a club and go see, go see Phish, or go see, a bunch of the jam bands, go see Blues Traveler, or go see whoever, Widespread Panic or Aquarium Rescue Unit, and you're basically going to a bar. And the level of musicianship that those guys brought, all of those bands, brought to the table right off the bat was just, incredible. So it was a blast to be there.
Well, it doesn't surprise me that speaking to a writer, that the lyrics are what got you of like the music scene in general or at large. Are there any songs or lyrics that you can recall that really inspired you? Because I was going to ask you what helped you become a writer, but I could hear, already you've almost answered that question in a roundabout way. What lyrics do you find inspiring or very touching, whether it's the Grateful Dead or otherwise?
As far as Phish goes, I've always really liked Squirming Coil. For whatever reason, that song has always drawn me in. And maybe it was because it was one of the first songs of those that I heard, but I think it's some of their finest, combination of lyrics and music. Quite frankly, I think it's just a beautiful song. But when I was first listening to, so my first Grateful Dead bootleg was a show from Hershey Park in 1985. And it's a really wild show. It's a very cool show, and, gets pretty trippy at different points and so forth. But right after that, I got a copy of the Grateful Dead's album, American Beauty. And I was listening to that, and I heard this song called Ripple. And the lyrics to Ripple are like, just timelessly beautiful. It's one of those songs that, you just feel like has been around forever and could be around forever. And I remember thinking to myself, first of all, I've never heard lyrics like this, there is a fountain that was not made by the hands of man. You know what I mean? Just all these things. It was incredibly poetic. And I hadn't heard that level of poetry and lyrics before. And it also really intrigued me because that band sounded nothing like the band on my bootleg, but I knew it was the same band. And I was really fascinated, like, how the hell is this the same band, But I'd say as far as lyrics, that was the first jam band lyric that really like grabbed me was Ripple by the Dead.
Yeah, you definitely grabbed onto something there with Ripple. Even simple lines like, if I knew the way, I would take you home.
Yeah.
Is very simple in terms of vocabulary and structure. But at the same time, when you get to the meaning behind it and you truly picture a narrator speaking a thought like that, I would take you home, which kind of implies that he or she doesn't know the way, which also implies that you don't know the way because you would need to be taken home. And it like really places you somewhere that I think where all of us has been, kind of this desperation and a need to belong, but no one can really help you with direction, but someone's there by your side anyway.
Yeah. There's a great spiritual teacher named Ram Dass, who was actually, he was a partner of Timothy Leary's back in Harvard, during the early acid days. And he was actually, very tight with everybody in the counterculture, but was at like the first acid test with the Dead and stuff like that, pops up everywhere. But he has a beautiful thing that he used to say, which is, we're all just walking each other home. And what you were just saying reminds me a lot of that. I hadn't directly put those two together, but yeah, no, I think that's very, very well put, Brian.
Well, thank you. It's Robert Hunter will do that. He'll contain multitudes in maybe 12 syllables or so. Absolutely. But getting back to Phish, or at least something or a band inspired by Phish, you predominantly write nonfiction and like significant events, whether it's in your life or a certain counterculture at large. But Merch Table Blues, your latest release, is fiction. It's a novel. So before we get into what inspired you, can you just give us a quick synopsis of the book?
Sure. Yeah. So Merch Table Blues, I call it a sex, drugs, rock and roll murder mystery. So it's meant to be, a fun read, an exciting read. And I think, basically you have a band that's out of Burlington that's starting to gain a following and playing, different clubs and stuff like this. So I would say, akin to those 90, 91, 92 venues that I was seeing Fish in. And so basically the premise is, what if a band with a cult following, what if it was an actual cult? And there are murders involved, and there's a tour involved, and there's, partying involved, and there's all sorts of stuff. And so obviously, I drew a lot of inspiration from our community for this. And, I dropped little Easter eggs throughout the book. So if people are into the scene, into the Fish scene, or know some Dead stuff even, or whatever, there'll be things that they pick up on that, a general reader wouldn't. And I thought, I had fun with that too. But, it's meant to be a cool, fun, like, it's a perfect, I picture people going to shows in the summer, and just like passing this book around and chilling out for a couple hours before the show and reading it and, dog-earing the pages and all that stuff. Like it's that kind of book.
Yeah, I can vouch for it. I read an advanced copy, thank you, that you provided. And when I was reading it, I picture it as kind of when you're on tour and you're in a new neighborhood or a tour stop where there's not much else to do except the venue that's there. I was thinking like Alpine Valley or Deer Creek. Like once you get to your hotel or campsite, you're there, unless you go to Panera or something for lunch. I think that's the sort of thing I pictured, whether you're in a hotel room or in a campsite or by your car and you need to kill a few hours. It's a really quick read. And it is a fun page turner. It's not terribly complex. And I mean that as a positive, that it's just a good, fun summer read. And I like the fact that you've been able to weave in familiar touchstones and settings that anyone who's been to a couple of shows for a while would be able to connect to. But what led you to write a novel as opposed to nonfiction? Because you seemed very comfortable in your predominant genre.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I first wrote the first draft of this book I wrote 21 years ago. And this was before I had done any nonfiction. And my intention was to just write novels. But I couldn't quite get it right. And interestingly enough, so in those intervening years, I'd written other manuscripts that I sort of like left alone and they just didn't work for whatever reason. That was it. This premise always just stuck with me. And I thought, there's something here, this idea of a cult following being an actual cult and, the tour and murders along the way. And also the narrator. So it's told in the first person, which means you're basically hearing the I did this and I did that. And it's told through the perspective of a guy who has been asked by the lead singer to run the merch table and basically roadie for them for this tour. And so he's coming into this scene with completely fresh and open eyes, and he's meeting all these people. We know as the readers that there's been murders from the first page, but you don't know who in the band or in the cult or whoever is involved in these things. And I love that premise. It always seemed really engaging to me. So I'd pick it up and I'd tinker with it and I'd put it down. And then I'd work on another book and I wouldn't, look at this thing at all for 2 or 3 years. And then I'd pick it up again. So finally, during COVID lockdown, basically, I sort of dug back into it. And it was almost like, a once like last ditch effort at making this thing, work. And so I did put a bunch of work into it and connected with my publisher, Manic D Press, and Jennifer, who is a founder of Manic D, really loved the book right away and sort of got what was going on there. And they've done, classic, great sort of edgy books since like the mid 80s. So that was a really nice connection for this book too.
I really enjoyed the first person perspective because as an now, I guess, an older fan compared to some people I see at shows, now when I go to Fish concerts, I keep saying that the audience is getting younger, but it's not true. It's the opposite. I'm just getting older. And so I like this idea that I almost want to shout at our narrator. He gets a call from his childhood friend, without spoiling too much, like you said, who asks him to be part of the merch booth. And he looks at his musician, his lead singer friend. What came to me is kind of this Oliver Stone vision of Jim Morrison, like this mystic, this guy who you can't always quite figure out, but is also very charismatic at the same time, crossed with almost famous, where kind of this innocence going on tour. And I was thinking about it and saying, don't go, stop. Like it's only going to lead to trouble. You don't know enough yet. And so that really engaged me right from the start, because as I'm an English teacher, I'm a middle school English teacher, and I teach my students about what's called the inciting incident, right? The first part of the book that gets the plot running. And when he gets that phone call, that's the inciting incident. And I always want to just shout into the character and say, don't do it. It's only going to lead to trouble. So I was hooked right away.
Oh, that's great to hear. I'm so glad. Yeah. And that's, definitely the lead character, or I should say the musician lead character, Richard Payne Knight is his name. He and the narrator go back to the time when they were kids. Yep. And you're absolutely right. Like, Richard Payne Knight has always been sort of a fascination to this guy. And he's a little obsessed with him, I think, and a little, enamored with him in the way that you look up into somebody who just seems to like oozing charisma and talent, and, has always drawn people to them and so forth. And, kind of wants to be like him, but doesn't quite have all those things. And that continues on into this relationship. So it does add sort of to that tension and mystery, because you have this long, deep friendship. And at the same time, it's not quite a trustworthy friendship, so
yeah.
you're a little on edge. And there's a lot in here really about friendship and about loyalty. And how do you maintain that? And where are the boundaries that you have to draw, and all those things? And I think there's, so this is certainly a fun read. It's meant to be, exciting and all that stuff. But I think at its heart too, there are some good questions being asked there about those things, that are maybe a little next level on that.
Yeah, and not just questions, but also images. I loved your use of imagery. I recently listened to your interview with Clay Bird, who hosts his own podcast called We Are Everywhere. He's been on this show. I've been on his. I have a huge amount of respect for him. And when he asked you, I think the question was, how many shows have you been to? And you had to estimate. You're not entirely sure. You're not one of those fans that has a brain that remembers every single show. And something you said really reached me when you said that eventually it's more about images and tableaus and sort of feelings that are evocative of being somewhere, as opposed to the facts of what show I was at. Like, what do you remember? What are some crystallized images? And it really connected with me when you said that on his podcast, because when I was reading your book, I wrote down this selection from it. It's from the very beginning, so it's not a spoiler. But this is when Virgil, our hero, gets the phone call from his friend Richard, and he's driving across upstate New York to Burlington. And I went to college in Buffalo. And they're not exactly that close, right? They're across the state, but they are on the same latitude, right? They're about the same distance north, I think. So here's what stood out to me as he's driving across New York State. You wrote, the worn out wipers smeared mist across the windshield, blurring boundaries between the interstate, sky, and my own foggy mood. Industrial smokestacks rose like ancient Roman columns around the upstate city of Syracuse, New York. It was as if a gray veil had been pulled across the world. As I drove through dark stretches of bleak October earth, there were ghosts in every dip of featureless landscape between Ithaca, New York, and Burlington, Vermont. The sky bled with moisture that was neither snow, rain, or sleet, but some mixture of all three. And when I read that paragraph, I said to myself, this guy has driven all over upstate New York, because that in a tableau is exactly what it's like in the late fall or early winter. And they kind of blend together up there anyway, because winter starts like October 1st. Mm-hmm. So to me, a teacher I know tells her students that in their brains, they have what's called a personal archive, where they file every experience they've ever had. And when you're a creative writer, that's where you dig from. Your personal archive.
Yeah. So it's funny. My brother was just reading the book, and he was texting me different questions. And there were a couple of things that he asked me about that he was right there. He's about 8 years older than me, I guess 8 or 9. And he sort of picked up on that I was using things that I remembered from my childhood as sort of being younger and seeing he and his friends. And there's just a couple small details in there. But yeah, those are like, and I said to him, like, it's kind of random, the things that I pull out to use as like specifically the way that Richard's father died was immediately, a payloader flipped over and killed him when Richard was young. And this is something that happened to a friend of my brother's like many, many years ago, like 30 years ago or something, but it just stuck in my head, so you're absolutely right. This is as a writer, you do file those things away. And I've always described my brain, especially, around these kind of things when it comes to writing, as impressionistic.
Very much so.
I sort of, I collect all those things, and then I figure out how to like paint that picture in a way that can bring the reader in. And that's, to me, that is, I can research things and I can look things up and I can do interviews, and you do all those things with nonfiction. But then to be able to put them together is where that part, comes in handy, and to make an evocative scene. And it's, I want my reader, whatever book it is, whether, I don't care if it's nonfiction or fiction or poetry or whatever, like I want to give my reader an experience. I want them to be transported, and experience something that they haven't before. And at the same time, something that they can also connect back to their own, lived life, because we have these universal experiences as well of friendship, of love, of, brokenheartedness, or, joy, or whatever it might be. And so, there's ways to do that. And that's, I guess, what you work on as, in your craft.
So when it's released, which is in early May, where can readers find a copy of Merch Table Blues?
Oh, you can find it anywhere you buy books. It'll be available. If you go online, I always encourage people to go to a place called bookshop.org, which is essentially, it's imagine Amazon, but it's all independent bookstores. Independent bookstores get supported by sales from bookshop.org. So you can go to your Amazon, you can go to your Barnes & Noble, you can go, if your local independent bookstore does not have it, they can order a copy. It will be available anywhere. But if you do go online, I'd encourage you to go to bookshop.org and order it there.
So we learned about you as an author. Let's hear about your background as a fan. And we're going to go into the attendance bias lightning round, Peter.
Attendance bias lightning round.
So you mentioned earlier that your first show was in Potsdam, New York. Do you happen to remember either the date or any other memories surrounding it?
I should remember the date. And it just, as you were saying that, it completely went out of my head. So I don't.
I'll find the date. You tell me about it then.
Yeah. Well, actually, you know what? So it was Earth Day on 1991. So whatever day Earth Day is every year, that's the day it was. And I'm blanking on what it was. But yeah, so basically, again, my friends and I hung out with a lot of musicians. And there's a school called Crane School of Music that's actually, connected to Potsdam College. So a lot of them were what they called Cranies. They were Crane School of Music students. And they were very well versed in, things that Phish were doing, like they were interested in the jazz element, or even like the barbershop quartet element, these different things that, I got turned on to by listening to them talk about, what the band was doing. And they were really, I heard the jams and I heard all this different stuff, and that was cool to me. But I could also hear that they were blending a bunch of different influences that were more overt, I'd say, than, I'd heard in the Dead. The Dead had different influences in a lot of ways. So anyway, my friends basically controlled the money that was spent on Earth Day activities, because they were all hippies and they were in charge of Earth Day. And so they decided to, for Earth Day, bring in Phish to play at Potsdam. And, I have great memories of it because it was such a homey, again, there was no charge even, because the school paid however much they paid Phish to come play. And it was just in this auditorium, it was kind of empty. I mean, I don't even know how many people knew about Phish at that point, even on the campus. My friends and I brought a keg in, and we had it like right on the floor somehow, like under some coats or something. We're dancing around. But before the show, we were helping carry in the band's equipment, because I don't even think they had any roadies at that point, even like one, maybe a sound person or something. But anyway, so we were helping them carry in the equipment. And I remember going back and forth, and we got down to like the only two things left in the back of the truck were trampolines and the vacuum. And I remember saying to John Fishman, he was, in there carrying things back and forth, like, do you need these? And, I pointed the vacuum. Do you need? Yeah, I play that. Okay. Like, at that point I had no idea, like, what that even meant, but he was earnestly saying, like, yes, I need the vacuum on stage because I play it. And then same with the trampoline. Do you guys need these? Oh yeah, we use those too. okay. So, they pulled out all those stops on at that Potsdam show, and they hopped on the trampolines, and there is a big vacuum cleaner solo in the show as well. It was very fun. It was really easy. But as soon as they started playing, as chill as the scene was, these guys were just playing at a different level than anybody else. They just were.
Yeah, when you listen to those early 90s shows and you name checked a couple of other bands about, at the time, what the scene looked like, even a band like Chakra, who was relatively big within the scene, but not so much on a more widespread level. It really is incredible the amount of talent that was going around. And what you said just now about the show being paid for by student events or student affairs, there's really no better phrase as a college student to see the words free with college ID or free with student ID. Like that's the best. No matter what it is, it's worth going. And especially to be, I'm guessing it's SUNY Potsdam.
Yes.
Am I right on that? Okay. So I would there's really no better time to be a student at a SUNY school, State University of New York, than the early 90s, somewhere upstate, because there were so many of them, and Phish seemingly was playing every single one, maybe every other month.
Yeah, no, they would play, and up in our town there was also Clarkson and St. Lawrence, and they would play there too. And so they were, or we would hop over to Burlington and go see them at Burlington. I remember going to see Blues Travel in Burlington and Trey coming on stage. I think that was it. Yeah, and doing like this big mouth jam with John Popper, and it was really, as somebody. So this is going to be like a little maybe like deep into the scene, but there was a promoter named Bill Graham who was key in the Dead's career, key in lots of musicians' career, ran the Fillmore East and West, and was a huge concert promoter. His son David Graham was on the East Coast at the right time, just the right time when this jam band scene started to come about, and he was a big key player in helping promote these bands and getting them out there. And for somebody who, like me, who came from the Dead scene and knew, Bill Graham, knew that name and everything, to have a Graham associated with these bands, and then to go and see these bands and to see, that they were clearly influenced by, improvisational rock music, as well as, other different elements. And so they were coming from a place that was very familiar to all of us in the Dead scene. Most of them made no bones about the fact that they had been to shows or been influenced by the Dead or whatever. And I think also tried to distance themselves from that at different points to not get consumed by the Grateful Dead, energy. I will say without a doubt, at those early Phish shows, at the early any jam band shows, it was Deadheads. Deadheads were the ones who picked up on what was going on, and then it became, they have their own fans. But, I will say we who were there in those early shows, like that's where we were coming from, and it was a really refreshing to see, again, bands that were pushing these different musical envelopes in their own ways, clearly with this spirit.
And there was a lot of cross-pollination also. Trey has even cited Aquarium Rescue Unit as the inspiration for Llama, the Phish song, because what he said when he saw ARU play, that it was so fast, that they played at such a high tempo and so quickly. He wanted to write a song like that, but it doesn't sound like Aquarium Rescue Unit. It's all Phish, and it's even part of the Gamehenge saga. There's still that little bits of cross-pollination where they're peers and learning from one another, as artists tend to do.
And, everybody in that scene has love for Colonel Bruce Hampton. I mean, he was like the godfather, the scene, and such a great, eccentric character, but, really brought along a lot of young musicians too. And was a mentor, I think, to certainly O'Teal. Now we see O'Teal's, what has happened with his career. He started out in Aquarium Rescue Unit, because Colonel Bruce brought him up. So, I mean, I will tell you a quick story about Aquarium Rescue Unit. So the first time I saw them was at a little bar in Rochester, New York, and the band got up there and they started playing, and they were just sick. They were ripping it up. And then I saw this guy sort of wandering around in front of the stage, and my first thought was like, oh, he must be the janitor. I don't know. He looked like he was custodian. Like he had, I don't know if he had like keys hanging from his belt, but he should have. Disheveled, whatever. And he looked kind of like just out of it. And he was wandering around. And then he makes his way up on stage. And I was like, oh my God, this guy is going to go and do something crazy to this band. make a scene or something. And then of course it was Colonel Bruce, and he got up there and he remained like that, that same sort of state throughout the show, but was like incredibly, it was almost a shamanistic experience when you would see him, because he was really a character and a really cool guy. So I think everybody in that scene, who came out of that era has a lot of love for Colonel Bruce.
What's your not your most recent, but your most memorable recent Phish show?
I had a good time. I went to Magnaball. That wasn't my last one, but I did have a good time there. I had been to, different Phish festivals along the way, starting with Arrowhead Ranch. And then I lose track. There was one on an Air Force base at one point that I went to. I think there was one in Maine. I don't know. I went to a bunch of different ones. But so this was, this was 6 years ago, Magnaball. So
also
this was
in
more
upstate New York.
Yeah, in upstate New York. And that was a blast. It was really fun. It was a Watkins Glen. And I went up in an RV and stayed. And, it was just a cool scene. It was what they've been able to do with festivals just on their own has been wild to watch. How they've developed, the whole thing and just made it their own. But yeah, I had a blast at Magnaball.
If you had a time machine and you could go back to witness any Phish moment, whether it was on stage or off stage, where or when would you go?
Oh gosh. I've never been to any of those Halloween shows. So I believe they did Remain in Light.
They did, right? In 1996, yeah.
I would go see that. That would be really, really cool to see. And I've heard it, and I thought it was incredible. But that's one of my favorite ones that they did. So I'd say that.
And final question: what is the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a Phish show?
Probably myself in the mirror.
When was this show played?
So by the time July 91 rolled around, I was astonished to find this. Phish had already finished a 4-month winter and spring tour that started in February and ended in May. So by the time they got to July, they were completely warmed up. They took a short break from playing live in June, but they used June to start recording A Picture of Nectar. And that would become their first major label album debut for Elektra Records. So by the time they got to this show in July, they were more than warmed up. They were fired up. They were already mid-year form. And the summer 91 tour, I would argue, is probably best known for two things. One would be the abundance of soundboard recordings. Almost every show you could find, whether it was when you were collecting tapes or now Phish.in, is a soundboard. And second, the presence of the giant country horns, which at the time it was Dave Grippo and Russ Remington on saxophone and Carl Gerhard on trumpet. Those horn players played with Phish for a handful of dates in July, beginning on July 11th at Battery Park in Burlington, and it ended a week after today's show on the 27th of July in Atlanta. So to me, that was the most memorable part when I would start collecting these tapes. I would always look for July 91. The horn section changed the sound of so many well-known classics. Even in 91, these songs were classics. So songs like The Landlady, Divided Sky, Mike's Song, Cavern, and notably, in my opinion, Susie Greenberg, which now when I hear, I almost always hear the horns in the background no matter what. Also, it reinvigorated some new covers. Frankenstein, which actually does have horns on the Edgar Winter Group recording. Take the A Train, Donna Lee, the old jazz standard. And my favorite when I was, 12 or 13 or 14 listening to Phish, when they would play Touch Me by The Doors. And of course, Fishman on vocals. And I would guess this show, the 20th, I would guess that this night, and most notably, I think the next night on the 21st, is probably the most well-known show of this era. I remember seeing it on almost every tape trader's list, and it's a great introduction to Phish. So where were you in the summer of 1991 that led you to Arrowhead Ranch?
At that point, so I had seen that Potsdam show, and really, I don't know how many shows I saw in between there. I couldn't tell you, but I will tell you in those, from 91 into the mid to late 90s, I would go and see Phish, wherever I could. And, getting tickets was never an issue or anything like that. So if they were within striking distance, I would go. And Arrowhead Ranch was, going back to David Graham. So David Graham ran Arrowhead Ranch. And being in, the Western New York region, we knew, that this was going on and there were shows that were being put on there. This was my first time going to Arrowhead Ranch. But, it just for the headspace I was in and for what I was doing was like Fish, Arrowhead Ranch, weekend camping, like, yes, I will be there. And it was to this day one of my favorite, musical scene memories. And by that, I mean, it was small. I don't think there was any security at the whole place. If there were, it was like somebody they gave T-shirts to who were us too, Yeah. I think there, anything that was like an area you weren't supposed to go just had like a little piece of rope across it, And even like during the show, it was like very fluid, people just moving in and out. I think at one point in the shows, Trace gives a shout out to people in the showers, and it was just a campground. And so, yeah, it was a real, I think it was and you weren't there unless you knew you were kind of in the know, you know what I mean? Unless you understood like, yeah, this is a worthwhile place to go. Cause it's not like it was an obvious, place to end up. You had to sort of know like to go there. So everybody who's there, and you can see the whole show too on YouTube, by the way. It's that, there's a videotape of the whole thing, which I've watched recently and it was really fun to watch. But, it was just a really cool laid back scene. Everybody was really loose. And, let's see, the Spin Doctors and the Authority opened on the first night. And then the Radiators and TR3 opened on the second night too. So, there was just a bunch of bands wandering around. Again, it was that real sense of community, I'll tell you a funny story too. There was the after the first night, I was wandering, probably not in the most lucid state of mind down this mountain road.
Is that when you were the weirdest thing you've ever seen at a Fish show?
I was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. Yeah. Yeah. So I was wandering down this mountain road in the dark by myself after the show, just sort of meandering. And all of a sudden, this limousine comes driving up. Like there's nobody around, nothing, just me walking down a mountain road, and a limo pulls up. It stops next to me. The window comes down. The guy inside says, "Have you seen," who the fuck did he ask for? Oh my God, I'm completely blanking on it. He asked if I had seen some musician who wasn't even playing there that night, and he's like your Kaukonen or something like that. And I was like, no, he's not playing. And he was like, okay. He's like, you like the 10,000 Maniacs? And I said, yeah, they're good. He's like, this guy's the guitar player. The guy leans over, like waves to me. I was like, hey man, what's up? Oh, he asked for Joe Walsh. The limo stops. That's right. The limo stops. The window goes down and he goes, hey, have you seen Joe Walsh, man? And I was like, Joe Walsh? No, Joe Walsh isn't playing here. He's like, oh, okay. Do you like 10,000 Maniacs? So anyway, the guy leans over and waves. I'm like, hey, what's going on? Anyway, so window rolls up and the limo keeps driving. I'm like, it's just one of those moments. So let me answer that. What's your weirdest Fish moment? Like that was probably my weirdest moment because it was just so fucking random.
So is that why you have attendance bias toward this show, or at least this version of Chalkdust Torture, the inclusivity, the feeling of community at Arrowhead Ranch?
Yeah, I kind of, honestly, I picked it because it was the first song of that first show of it. And it just, you can see in the video and you can hear it and everything, like the energy was just fantastic, and everybody was just stoked to be there. It's not a particularly stellar version of Chalkdust or anything like that. It's not like this is the most ripping Chalkdust Torture ever, but it was the most ripping version of Chalkdust Torture that was being played at that moment. And, it was just a really great kickoff to the whole time.
Well, let's break it down. I agree. It's not the most ripping, you got to hear this version of Chalkdust Torture, but as I listen to it, it is great to hear, if nothing else, for posterity and to kind of keep track of how Chalkdust Torture has developed, because it was fairly new at that time. It was recorded for a Picture of Nectar, and I have the stats somewhere. I have them here. It debuted in February of that year, in February 1991. This is the 38th time it's ever been played. But when you think about that, February to July, 5 months approximately, to have one song played 38 times compared to today, that's unthinkable. They don't even play 38 shows on a tour anymore. So that, yeah, it's important to go back and just kind of hear for anyone who's ever only listened to Phish from, 2009 forward, or even 1994 forward. This is, an important piece. So the recording opens with a stage announcer, and the stage announcer says,
"We'd like to give a very, very heavy-duty Arrowhead Ranch camper welcome to..." I can't hear you guys. Are you alive or what? What's the story? All right, ladies and gentlemen, the Arrowhead Ranch is proud to welcome Phish.
And it's really fun that we talked a little bit earlier about imagery and being evocative and setting a scene for a setting and drawing the reader in. When I was listening to this guy announcing at the beginning of this track, I heard the 90s.
Yeah. I think that's David Graham, by the way, too, doing
the
announcement. I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah.
Well, he was a man of his time then, because when I heard this, he talked about hippies on Earth Day at a upstate New York college. That's very early 90s stereotype. And this guy really is too, as a stage announcer. But it starts a little funkier than I would expect. I would expect Chalkdust to be a straight rocker, but at this time, it was definitely still finding its groove. Did you know this song at that time? Do you remember?
I probably didn't. Unless I had heard it on a bootleg, I wouldn't have heard it. So I can't tell you specifically. I honestly don't remember, but I do, I've always loved that riff is just a monster riff, and it's just such a great way to start a show. Like,
it's a very Led Zeppelin, very evocative.
It's really, for them especially, like it's just a great riff. It's really heavy. It pulls you right in, and you're like, you're right into the show. There's no like slipping into it. And you just want to dance and go nuts, and you can see that on the videotape. Like everybody, one of my favorite things about the videotape too, when you look at it, is like, you see all the crowd up front, and then you pull back and you see like, normally it'd be like, oh, I guess we're just seeing the first 20 rows and people are like rocking out or whatever. When you pull back, you realize there was nothing behind those people. It was really like that was the whole crowd, and people off to the side and everything. But everybody, as soon as they kicked into that, the whole place lit up.
You mentioned when you saw them at Potsdam, and in that time, in like 1991 in general, that it was so clear that their musicianship and their quality was kind of a cut above the rest. And it's really fun listening to them in 1991 because their gear, the literal instruments that they're playing, compared to today especially, sounds very amateur. Yeah. It sounds like not quite toys, but stuff that you could just afford at Sam Ash or whatever local music store you went to. Page has an organ solo at about 2 minutes and 15 seconds. And I hated to write this in my notes, but it's true. It sounds very silly, but in his ability, you could hear the greatness of the song, of what it would become.
as it flutters away. And all the solution is get time, listen, be. Not to educate somebody's brain.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, like there's a really human aspect to listening to those shows because, I mean, what you hear now is just like, yeah, the highest end possible equipment, guys who've now been playing together for another 30 years or whatever it is, and mastering their instruments that long, and figuring it all out. So it's almost like, I want to use the word like supernatural, but there's like, it's so polished and so like perfected now. It was still kind of dirty then, you know what I mean? And the sound system was like whatever sound system they had, or I guess whatever sound system was at the venue. I guess it depends on where the gig was, but yeah. And, sort of warts and all. And I think that at that time, especially added to the appeal, because they weren't much, they're only maybe a couple years older than me, if that, you know what I mean? And so it was really close to just seeing peers who were just incredibly talented. You're like, wow, okay, these guys are like basically like, we're all sort of hanging out together, but at the same time, like they've obviously hit a different level musically. But yeah, the gear made a big difference because it just sounded still like that's the guitar rig, that is the organ, that's the organ sound or whatever. And they were individual pieces that came together, but now it's just like, fish, like bold, big bold letters.
And it didn't even stay that way for too long, because fewer than 2 years later, then they were touring with a baby grand piano by spring 93. So it really, just to put an emphasis on their rise and their sharp ascent into popularity. And from 3:30 to 5 minutes of this Chalkdust Torture, I love that Trey's solo is paired with Page's in a way, because for the first minute of the song or so, I believe Page is on piano, but he's barely audible, even though this is, I think it's a soundboard recording. If not, it's an exceptional audience recording. And the enormity of the band's talent, it's still a couple years away, but you could hear the kernel of it in Trey's solo. He even throws in some tricks and some touch points in his solo that he still uses today. If they played Chalkdust Torture tomorrow, there are some parts in his solo that you could still link back to 1991. And it's just that consistency, but that change that we talked about, one of the billion reasons that we love him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the elements were clearly there. You know what I mean? All of the elements. And then again, now you add another, whatever, 30 years of playing together and all that stuff. And
that's it.
The sauce. But it was all, it was all there. And including, I will say, like the ambition. Like you don't make this big song cycle and have this epic stuff unless you're an ambitious person. And I think, in some ways, ambition is in the rock scene, considered to be like, tacky or something. Like you're not supposed to have ambitions. And that's something that I talk about in Merch Table Blues too. It's like ambition is sort of like the dirty secret of musicians because, it's supposed to just be the art and the music and the partying or whatever like that. But, any musician that quote unquote makes it is also a really ambitious person because it takes a ton of work,
and the artist.
And it's a grind, and an artist. And these guys were clearly like, they had big ambitions, and their influences were big. And again, you don't sort of take in that sort of influence and start to put something out there without like challenging yourself, to up your game to that level if you can. And I think that was really cool to see too. It's like, no, these guys they've got all the different elements that you need, and also they're ambitious and they want to make this really happen. And they did, clearly.
So Peter Connors, author of the upcoming novel Merch Table Blues, thank you so much for coming on to Attendance Bias, for discussing Chalkdust Torture from July 20th, 91 at Arrowhead Ranch, for talking about upstate New York and what it was like to be a student at a SUNY school in the early 90s. And of course, talking about your background of writing, but more to the point, Merch Table Blues, a novel that will be available, I believe, as of May 3rd of this year, 2022. And can you just give us one more quick reminder of the websites you mentioned where readers can find them?
Sure. So you can go to bookshop.org. You can get it at any bookstore that you like to buy books, but that's a good online one to go to, as well as your Amazon and like that. You could also go to the publisher's website, and they're Manic D Press. So MANICD Manic D Press. It's either .com or .org, and you can order directly from there. And that's actually a really good way to support a very cool independent press out of San Francisco too.
All right, well, Peter, thank you so much again. I'm looking forward to recommending it and talking to people about the book once it's released officially. But I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. It's good talking to you.
And that's it for today's interview with Peter Connors. And normally it's time for the Attendance Bias fact check, but I'm pretty proud to say that there really wasn't much that I had to check after this interview. This was more of a double up for trivia and did you know for today's episode. So we're still going to call it the fact check, but this is more just kind of filling in the blanks.
Attendance Bias Fact Check.
Peter said that his first Grateful Dead show was at the Kingswood Music Theater in 1987. The specific date of that show was June 30th, 1987. It featured a Touch of Grey opener and lots of more fan favorites, including Loser, Candyman, Ramble on Rose, Scarlet Begonias, Fire on the Mountain, of course, Estimated Prophet, Eyes of the World, and even the first Spanish Jam in 73 shows up to that point, plus a Box of Rain encore. He also mentioned that his first Grateful Dead bootleg, which was from Hershey Park in 1985, was played on June 28th, 1985, and it's made up of 2 short sets. The whole show is on YouTube with a soundboard recording. At the start, Peter and I had a little bit of difficulty nailing down the date of his first show, which was at SUNY Potsdam on Earth Day, 1991. The specific date was April 21st, 1991. And like most shows from that year, there is a soundboard recording of it available on fish.in and a ton of great old school Fish in the set list, including Forbin's Mockingbird, where Trey gives a very detailed and descriptive explanation of what's going on in the song in the context of the entire Gamehenge story. Peter also mentioned that for that show, some of his friends were there, and they were music students. They were mostly interested in Fish's barbershop quartet songs, and so they must have left happy because the band closed the first set with Sweet Adeline. When talking about helping Fishman unload the truck with all the equipment, Peter mentioned that there was a, quote, big vacuum cleaner solo during the show. I didn't listen to the whole thing, but I couldn't find the vacuum cleaner solo, but Peter may have been thinking of the encore of I Didn't Know, during which Fishman played the trombone. In any case, the show is well worth a listen if you enjoy Fish for the song structure, creativity, and dexterity. Peter and I talked extensively about the SUNY institution of colleges throughout New York State. If you're not from New York, SUNY, S-U-N-Y, stands for State University of New York, which is the state school throughout New York. And it has campuses in 64 different locations throughout New York State. As mentioned, these colleges, or at least the locations or cities or towns in which they are, were regular stops on Fish tours throughout the late 80s and early 90s. Places like Ithaca, New Paltz, Oneonta, Buffalo, Binghamton, Potsdam, they're all pretty much still hippie strongholds today. Peter also said that he once saw Blues Traveler in Burlington, and Trey came on stage to play. I couldn't find a specific gig for that, but the closest I came was that Blues Traveler played at the Burlington Memorial Auditorium on January 25th, 1991. Trey came on toward the end of the show to add vocals to the song Sweet Talking Hippie. And finally, when talking about Fish's gear in 1991, I mentioned that less than 2 years after these Arrowhead Ranch shows, Page would upgrade from the electric keyboard to a baby grand piano. The first show with the baby grand was on February 3rd, 1993 at the Portland Expo in Portland, Maine. With the new baby grand, Fish opened the first show of that tour with the Rolling Stones cover of Loving Cup for Page to show off his new instrument. That was also the Fish debut of Loving Cup. And that's it for today's episode with Peter Connors, the author of Merch Table Blues and several other books. If you check today's show notes, you'll see links on how you could find and purchase Merch Table Blues. I'd like to thank Peter for joining me today, Fish.net for providing all the information we needed for today's show, and Fish.in for a really awesome recording used for today's episode. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show. The best way you can do that is by leaving a rating and a review of the show on your favorite podcast app. You could also reach out to me on social media. I am usually most active on Instagram and Twitter. Please say hello and I will send you a free sticker and a thank you with a smiley face. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you next week on Attendance Bias.